Okay, so I'm going to introduce now our speaker for this evening. I'm really delighted that she's agreed to do this talk for us, particularly because it's something we had a request for. So Dawn Scott is a professor in mammal ecology and conservation at Keele University. She has over 20 years experience researching mammals, and she's studied urban foxes in the UK for approximately the last 9 years. Her research on urban mammals focuses on understanding the effects of urbanisation on animal ecology and how animals and humans can coexist in these landscapes. Her research has featured in multiple TV programmes and media, so we're really lucky to have her this evening. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I'm going to hand you over to Dawn Scott, who's going to talk to us all about urban foxes. Thank you very much, Dawn.
Thank you very much, Maria. Well, it's exciting to see you all, even though virtually. It's a bit weird having such a large audience from all over the world and not being able to see everybody and see all your reactions and take all your questions. But we'll do what we can this evening. I'll try and cover as much as I can about all the information I've been finding out about foxes with my research, but also try and answer all your questions as well. I might not be able to answer all of them because there's still a lot to find out. So I'm going to share my screen and get on with the talk, but if you do have any questions, stick them in the chat and we'll try and pick up as many as possible at the end. I'm hoping you can see that now, Maria. Just give me a nod.
Yeah, there you go. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, so as Maria says, I've been researching urban foxes now in the UK for around about 10 years. And we've got lots of different studies going on about urban foxes. So I'm going to try and give you a bit of an insight of what we found out and also why we started to research them. So first of all, the question is about urbanisation. So urbanisation is one of the largest forms of land use change in the whole world. So around about 4 billion people live in cities, and so most of their interactions with wildlife is in cities. By 2030, it's estimated there'll be 41 megacities across the world, and those megacities will have over 10 billion people in them. In the UK, around about 80% of people will live in urban areas, or they do live in urban areas. So, you know, we've got a large human population that's living in a habitat that's been adapted for people, but in these adapted habitats we have some species that can do quite well. And one of the things that's interesting for me is how different species can adapt to these habitats, how humans react to that adaptation, and how we can both basically live together. Because if anybody mentions foxes, you usually have differences in reactions. And I think that hopefully those reactions have started to change so people can understand that, you know, it is amazing to have a wild animal living in close proximity, but they can also bring some problems and issues and concerns that people have. So the urban habitats have changed in terms of their three-dimensional structures. They obviously don't have as much food in some areas. And so these create new landscapes, and we call these landscapes of fear and opportunity for animals. So there's areas of opportunity and there's areas of high risk. Only animals that have behaviourally flexible behaviour can actually adapt to these habitats. So behaviourally flexible species tend to be able to exploit urban areas better than specialist species. And foxes are one of those species that are behaviourally flexible. They're very adaptable, and we'll go into a little bit more about their natural history. The other thing that I'm interested in is the strong natural selection of urban areas. And so because of the changes in food and the changes in risk, then certain characteristics or traits may be selected over others for animals that can adapt. Now, urbanisation of animals, you know, UK foxes is a classic example, but urbanisation is happening all over the world, and species adapting to this new habitat there's some really interesting species that are adapting to cities. So in Singapore, we have otters living in Singapore. In Berlin, there's wild boars roaming around the streets. In many cities in North America, coyotes are resident. And there's a picture of a leopard here. There's leopard populations living in Mumbai. So if you are worried about your foxes in your back garden, there's other cities in the world with a lot bigger carnivores living next to them. Now, living in a city is obviously going to present some challenges for animals, but it's also going to provide some benefits. So in terms of benefits, resources tend to be more stable, and that's because people are providing food, possibly year-round water. There's more people feeding wildlife now, so there's been a shift changing people providing food, not just for foxes, but for other wildlife, and the foxes can exploit that as well. There's a lower risk of natural predation. There's lots of refuge sites. You'd be amazed where you can find a fox. I've found foxes hiding in compost bins on roofs and all sorts of places. They can get into very, very small spaces. And cities are more thermally stable as well, so you have less of the variation in temperature. But there are lots of costs of living in cities. So if there's a higher density of animals, that can lead to problems with regards to potential disease. You've got high road mortality. You've also got potential conflict with people. There's also risk of misadventure as well. So lots of cubs die in relation to getting stuck or injured in different places in cities. And there's possibly less natural food. So what they're exposed to, it might be less healthy as well. So some species are called urban exploiters. So these are species that can do better in an urban environment than actually they're rural. So you can find higher densities. And this includes foxes, but it also includes badgers as well. So those species that do well in urban area tend to be higher density because they have been released from competition in a natural environment. So you have high resources, so you can get more numbers supported by those resources, and less competition. And that naturally causes some species to do better in cities than others. So generally urban biodiversity is lower, but those species that can adapt tend to do well. So there's lots of different behavioural and ecological changes to living in a city. And there's a quote by Parker and Nylon, and they say that you might get an increase in density, so that's more animals. You might get an increase in intraspecific aggression. You can see this in humans. If there's too many people in a pub, you're going to get intraspecific aggression in high density areas. And also potential reduction in fear. And this is because animals are going to be exposed to people more frequently. So there's a higher chance of habituation. And that means that they're not going to run away every single time because there's people about all the time. So potentially a reduced fear. So these are characteristics of wildlife that could be going what we call syn urbanization, so adapting to urbanization. So some of the things that we've been looking at in urban animals is looking at activity patterns. So do they shift their behavior in relation to human behavior? So we've had foxes that have come out at 10 o'clock at night in a garden because they know they get fed at 10 o'clock at night in a garden, or they don't go and cross the road till after midnight when the cars have stopped going through. So we have seen shifts in activity patterns in relation to humans, which is very different in an urban compared to a rural habitat. We've got differences in home ranges, and home range is the size of an area that an animal needs to be able to fulfill its requirements. Territoriality means defending that territory. Usually if there's another group, it will be territorial to keep that other group out. That might be affected in urban areas. Patterns of movement, got lots of different things in here. Interactions, group size, sociality, risk avoidance, changes in diet, living in a city is different. Do they breed at different times? Is there a trait of intelligence or a personality trait that's more suited to urban habitats? Is there a variation in seasonal behaviour? So do they breed at different times or birth at different times? And what is disease prevalence as well? So high density populations, as we know with COVID, lots of individuals in the same area, you can have high transmission rates. So is urban areas have high disease? And what about the health? You know, if they're not moving as far and they're eating food from humans, then is their health any different? So loads of things that we've been exploring. So we haven't just been looking at foxes in isolation, but I will keep it to foxes today. We've also been looking at badgers and hedgehogs in urban environments. And that's because these form what we call a guild. So it's a guild of urban mammals And the reason why it's a guild is because they could all potentially eat the same food. So badgers are omnivorous, they'll eat all sorts of different things. Hedgehogs also are quite omnivorous, although they focus on insects, but they do eat lots of other things as well. And obviously foxes will eat more or less anything. So they can potentially compete with each other. And the other interesting factor is obviously one of them could potentially become the prey, and it's not the badger. Hedgehogs could potentially be predated by badgers and foxes. So I'm interested in this dynamic. They all seem to be doing quite well in urban areas, better than in rural in some cases. But what's that dynamic? What's supporting those communities? But I am just going to be focusing on foxes. So those of you that don't know about foxes, and it sounds like lots of people know about foxes on this call, they are the most widespread terrestrial carnivore in the world. They're also a colonizer, so they colonize multiple places outside of their range and obviously done very well. And the reason for this is they are extremely adaptable. So they're found anywhere from Arctic regions down to deserts. So hugely adaptable for many different habitats, as you can see from the map. The reason why they're so good is they're basically a small to medium carnivore. They can navigate lots of different things in terms of a three-dimensional structure. And they can also adapt their diet. So by eating everything and fitting in anywhere, they can actually exploit anything. And that's one of the problems that people have, is they're so good at adapting, but that's the reason why they've been so successful. So in an urban area, you've obviously got different types of food that they can exploit, and being opportunistic means that they're really good at finding what's ever available. They're good at finding refuge sites for dens, so they can under sheds, on roofs, I've had dens up trees, all sorts of little places for dens, but usually under sheds is a nice place for a fox to have a den. And one of the reasons why I think they're so adaptable is because of their ability to navigate the three-dimensional environment. So we see what's on the ground, but so many times when I've been up on buildings looking for foxes, they've been sat on roofs, climbing on roofs, you can walk past the fox and it'll be sat on a roof above you and you can smell it. So they're really good at navigating, jumping over fences and climbing on roofs. So really good at adapting to that three-dimensional. Whereas badgers struggle a little bit climbing and hedgehogs compared to foxes. So let's have a little talk about fox ecology, because I think one of the problems people have with foxes is they're not quite sure why they're doing what they're doing. But if you understand the fox ear and what they're doing, then it's easier to understand why they're screaming in the middle of the night and keeping you awake. So foxes live in social groups. The average group size is about 3.4. They are classified as social and solitary. So they're social in the fact that they will come together, and during breeding they are social. So obviously the mother and the cubs, and there can be two adults, two females, or a male and female helping to raise the cubs. But when they forage, they tend to forage solitary. So they're an interesting carnivore in terms of solitary and social. They're mainly nocturnal, but they can be active in the day. They communicate by smell. So when people smell foxes, they think, oh, what's that horrible smell? But that's their way of communicating with other foxes. This is their territory. This is who they are, possibly their breeding status as well. So there's lots of information they need to transmit by smell. They have 28 different vocalizations at least. So they use a lot of different calls. And in urban areas, it's actually quite hard to be heard. So they do have to shout quite loud. Over the noise of the traffic and everything. So there is a lot of vocalization, and they're usually calling to other members of their social group or to members outside their social group. And the females also call when she's in breeding season to bring in males to potentially mate with. So foxes only have one litter a year. And that is usually, so they breed around about January, February, and the cubs come out more or less in May, but it can vary. You can have early cubs, you can have slightly later, but they tend to breed in the winter, and that's where you get all those calls and those screams when they're breeding. And then you get all the problems with the cubs in May, June, when all the cubs are spilling out of the dens and causing chaos like puppies do. So they have one litter of cubs, about 5 to 6, but you can get two females crashing, so you can get big litters, but they're usually combined. They have what we call rest sites and then natal den sites, and they can move the cubs to a different area, and they will rest up in a site, but they don't rest up in always the same site. So they don't have a den where they rest up. They only have dens when they're having cubs, really. So the cubs emerge 4 to 6 weeks old in May. There's very high mortality in cubs. So even though when you see all the cubs, you think that's a lot of animals, and it feels like there's a lot of animals in May, June, we get lots of reports of foxes, but actually most of them will die. So only 1 in 5 foxes actually get to 2 years old. But if they are lucky, again and again, they can live between 10 and 14. And that's based on a captive fox. So one of the things I'm interested in foxes is the fact that they cause so much sort of polarization in views. It's quite a small carnivore. I've worked in lots of other countries with tigers and lions and all sorts of big animals causing potentially fatal. And so coming to the UK to look at research and seeing how villainized a small carnivore is quite interesting. What causes that? Why do we have this love-hate relationship with this animal? Partly it's due to history and how they've sort of been infiltrated in culture, stories, villainized, but it's also down to people's experience as well. But I just put this in because this is a clip from newspapers, and the media does tend to like to villainize the foxes. So this is a picture of fox bit my finger off. Obviously she's holding up the finger. And then there was another report that I picked out. So see how many negative words you can pick out in this report. A vicious urban fox went on the rampage in Cambridgeshire, terrorising 8 people during a 3-hour-long assault and holding them hostage in a sports club. So I've caught foxes. They're about the size of a fat cat. An average female fox is about 5.5 kilograms. You know, that's so they can quite easily be handled. Obviously they can bite and things, but they are quite small carnivores. I think the biggest fox that's been reported is around about 10 to 15 kilograms. So, and that was an unusual one. So I'm interested in what drives this attitude and this you know, fear and the problems, and can we help people coexist with foxes? Can we resolve the problems, find out why they're happening? Can we reduce that so people actually have positive experiences with animals rather than negative? So one of the questions we have and get is, are foxes out of control? Do we need to hunt them and control them and kill them? And I think there's been calls in urban areas, people saying, you know, they're out of control. We need to control the population. So one of the things I was looking at is the history of urban fox change. So in the 1930s, they were mainly reported in southern England. They were also in some cities in Scotland, but if we just look at England for now. And then by the 1980s, the population had increased and they were reported in more cities. And then in 2001, there was a report that said that they were now occupied more cities, but we weren't quite so sure how many cities. So based on this data, I wanted to find out what was the current distribution of urban foxes and how many there were, what the problems were, whether we could help sort of support people and also support foxes in coexisting. So one thing we did is we worked with Channel 4 for a programme called Foxes Live. And during this programme, what was really good is we could set up a website that people could go on and load in their fox records and their opinions of foxes and things like that. So that was really good. So this was the website. You could go online, you could fill in the sightings, and you could also do an opinion questionnaire. And we had foxes that were radio collared, so you could follow where they'd been the night before. So quite interactive to try and get people to start thinking about foxes. So from that media presentation, within 3 weeks, we got around about 16,000 reports of urban foxes across the UK. And they could submit photos as well. So we had nearly 3,000 photos. And what this showed is that foxes had spread across the UK to more cities, and they were more or less widespread. So they seem to have expanded from the south, but now we're seeing similar numbers of foxes in more northern cities than they were in the 1980s. So what we tried to do is look at fox sightings density to see if we'd get an idea of where the numbers were. And obviously the sightings in London was very high, but we also got quite high sightings in Newcastle, Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham, Bristol, Bournemouth. They were sort of some of the cities which were higher. And we found that nearly 91% of cities that had said they had no foxes in the 1980s now had foxes. So larger cities are more likely to have foxes, and actually public green spaces are not very good for foxes. It's not very good habitat. So what is the good habitat for foxes? You can probably guess. So the question is, are urban foxes changing? Are they, so we know the distribution has changed, but are the numbers getting very high? Now, this is quite difficult because the estimates we have, in the 1990s, it was estimated there was 33,000 foxes across in the urban areas. The only really detailed study was done in Bristol, and they estimated around about 36 foxes per kilometre squared. So that was quite a high density. But in other areas, it was between 2 and 12. So there's quite variation in densities. We also know that in some cities, the population had completely crashed due to outbreaks of mange. So in Bristol, around about 1992, there was a massive crash. 95% of the fox population declined due to a highly virulent outbreak of mange. So we don't know what's happening. Some cities are going down, some cities they seem to be going up. They are definitely moved. They've colonised more cities across the UK, so it's not just a London urban fox anymore. So in terms of mange, I thought I'd just mention it. So mange is caused by a mite that buries into the skin, and it causes irritation. It causes the skin to crack, and it causes open wounds, alopecia, hair loss, and it is very painful. Here's an animal that's got apodema as well, so the eyes have all swollen up. So this is quite severe mange. You can see the characteristics of mange. So this mite can be treated, but it's quite prevalent in the fox population. It's quite a slow death, and animals can die. There's a breakdown in the metabolism in terms of the body starts to break down that skin as well. So what we did with our photos that people had submitted is we went and saw where mange was. So here's some pictures of photos of foxes. So you can hopefully have a look and see which ones you think have mange. We're looking not just for alopecia, so hair loss, because that could relate to molt. We're looking for sort of scabby skin underneath that molt. So you can see here the animal B on the top right. You can see scabbiness there, so that's got mange, and the one on the bottom right as well, you can see hair loss on the tail. You don't usually get hair loss on the tail unless it's mange. So we use this data to look at distribution of mange across the UK from the photos, and on average around 15% of foxes across the UK have mange. But what we were looking for is if there was any hotspots in the country and why these hotspots were occurring. So from that map, you can see where the current hotspot in mange is. So in this hotspot, around about 37% of foxes do have mange. And we think that fox movement causes this prevalence in mange. So it's being moved by foxes into new areas as they're potentially colonising. Mange can be treated in terms of either ivermectin or there are homeopathic treatments as well. But you know, it is a natural part of a disease that controls a population. So there is a debate around sort of treatment and how you would do that. So how do we actually estimate how many foxes there are? Because the media always ask me, how many foxes are there in cities? How many foxes are in London? And it's hard to say. I can't go and count them all. All I can do is estimate. So I can take a sample of an area. I can count how many foxes are there. I can set some rules, and then I can sort of extrapolate. But foxes do vary across cities, so that can be quite tricky as well. So this is what we did. We used the principle that fox has a territory. In urban areas, foxes tend to have territories that come together like a jigsaw puzzle, so they're right back to back. We know there's about 3.4 animals in a territory. A territory of foxes indicated if they have a litter, so if they have a litter. So what we did is we went and surveyed, and we asked people where they'd seen cubs. So we did this around about May, June to July, if they'd had a litter of cubs. And we went across a large area to work out how many social groups, and then we multiplied that by this average number of foxes. So instead of counting the actual number of foxes, we counted the number of family groups to get an actual comparative density across cities. So we distributed questionnaires across the different cities in the country. We use this data to then what we call GIS, so Geographical Information System. We put on all the points where we've got sightings of foxes and cubs. We've done this in, so we did it in 8 cities, including London, across the country. We distributed around about 30,000 questionnaires, and then we used this method to try and work out how many cubs, and then extrapolate that to family groups. So in Brighton, which is where I was based at the time, we worked out there was around about 3.5 family groups per kilometre squared. And then in London, it was about 3.1. So London, Brighton densities are quite similar based on this method. And that works out around about 11 to 12 foxes per kilometre squared. So if you think about the Bristol study, that was about 36, that's quite high. These were coming out quite similar. Now, you might have a few more animals in a social group, but in terms of the number of social groups, they're more or less stable. And they have increased in cities where they've colonised, like Newcastle, but in other cities where they've been for a while, the numbers seem to have stayed more or less similar. How else can we survey for density? We'll count the number of animals, so you can go and try and catch them all. So this is one of our studies in Brighton. We tried to catch and collar all our foxes in a single area so that we could make sure that we knew how many. And based on this method, we got 14 foxes per kilometre squared. So the two methods worked out quite similar. So we could check that we were doing the right thing in terms of extrapolating. When we're radio tracking foxes, lots of things happen in terms of data. Some really interesting things happen. So one of our foxes, called Fleet, decided to go on a little bit of a walkabout, more or less a 200-mile walkabout over Christmas and New Year. He just left Brighton, ran off and carried on running. So at the time, he was a record-breaking fox across the whole world. He was the largest distance ever recorded for a fox. But for us, it provided really valuable information about how foxes are dispersing across the country. So if we have foxes in one urban area, they can disperse and colonise another urban area. And that's probably what's happened. And also what we found with Fleet is there seemed to be something called neonatal habitat preference. So basically they prefer the habitat where they're born. So if he's born in an urban area, he's going to be looking for an urban area. So he ran out of Brighton, but then everywhere he stopped, he more or less stopped in a suburban back garden every night before he ran off across countryside and found another suburban back garden to settle in. So he was quite famous. He was featured on Spring Watch one year. And Chris Packham got really frustrated when we couldn't find him. We went driving after him trying to find him, and we couldn't find him, and then the collar unfortunately failed or something happened to the fox. So we've also used that home range data to answer lots of other questions, like what is the features of urban habitat that affects fox density and fox movement? So is there certain aspects of the city what foxes like more? So this was a paper that we did this year. So this was looking at the aspects of suburban gardens on home range size. And with this, what we found is they like bigger gardens. Their home ranges tend to be smaller. Whereas if you have highly packed in dense houses with small gardens, their home ranges have to be bigger. And that's probably reflecting on the quality of the resources, natural and anthropogenic, in those gardens. We also work with the RSPCA to look at what happens when you take a fox out of its habitat and put it into rehab. So these were foxes that were maybe being treated because they had mange or maybe injuries. They went into rehab centres and then we brought them back. So we were studying animals that didn't move compared to animals that had been displaced and then returned. And these are two maps. So the bottom one is an animal that's obviously before and after the same time period. And the one on the top is one animal that obviously the territory was on the left-hand side. So you can see that squiggle. And then when we released him in the same point. And then within basically 24 hours, he'd been displaced from his territory and run off. So what we were saying is actually, you know, if you take an animal out of its territory, it doesn't take long before that territory gets disturbed. And if you return them, they usually have to run off, and that can be a high risk in terms of mortality for them. So we also were looking at more detailed behaviour. So this is one of our home range. So this is Fleet, our amazing travelling fox. And this is his home range typically before he ran off. And you can see these are the points every 15 minutes of where he's been in the night. And from this, you can see he hangs around on 2 points. And you can probably guess what happens on these 2 points. So the top point, he gets fed at 8 o'clock by somebody in that house. And then at 10 o'clock, he gets fed in the other house. So what Fleet does most of his night, he just goes around the people's gardens that feed him, and the rest of the time he just sleeps. So he doesn't even go around his territory very much. So he's got a very small territory. This is his whole of his home range is 2 streets, and he spends most of his time just going to people's houses that he'll never get fed. So we know feeding in foxes. We've asked people what they've fed. And what they get fed is not necessarily very healthy. There's a lot of carbohydrate, lots of jam sandwiches and butties and leftovers and fat and things. So scraps and peanuts, leftover meat, cheese, jam sandwiches. So unfortunately, you know, it's lovely that people are trying to support wildlife, but there's a couple of things that are problematic to me. Firstly, the natural diet is being disrupted. And then we've also asked people, you know, what they feed and how they feed. So what they feed has got quite low nutrients, possibly high fat, and not very natural. And so we do see some obese urban foxes. And then the other thing with the video is what I'm showing is how people feed. So we asked people whether they fed foxes, and the national study, we had about 36% of people said that they occasionally fed foxes. We repeated the study in Brighton and it was about 13. So I'm going to guess around about 10%. So 1 in 10 people who are foxes in an urban area feed foxes. And when we ask people how they feed, 1 in 5 people feed at the back door and 1 in 5 people feed by hand. So these foxes are being fed regularly by hand. So I'm just putting that out there when people start to worry about foxes taking things from hands or going into people's houses. Many of these foxes are being exposed to being fed by hand or being fed by the back door. So how do we live with urban foxes? I think trying to understand what they're doing and when. So if they're screaming, you know that that's just a seasonal, they're breeding. It's not going to happen all the time. They will be quiet later on. And why they're being vocal is because they're living in a city. They do have to shout quite loud. So trying to understand fox ecology, I think, is really important, and having an opportunity to ask questions about foxes to understand what's happening and what you can do if you have a problem is really helpful. I do think we need to think about the amount of food that we give and how much we give, and for the welfare of the foxes as well as sort of population as well. If there's problems with pets, we need to make sure we've got better husbandry of pets in terms of if we're keeping, lots more people are keeping chickens in gardens and obviously lots of things outdoors. There's been a shift change, and so that could potentially lead to conflict as well. And we need to make sure people are not feeding by hand and reducing that interaction of encouraging them, because, you know, some other people don't particularly like that. So we need to be sensible in our interactions with wildlife to keep them safe. And we make sure we don't encourage them into houses. So I've got a few more minutes. I'm just going to tell you one thing that we're just about to finish off. It's been a bit delayed with COVID, but we had a survey done with Springwatch, and we asked people to submit videos of animals in their gardens. And this was to answer that question. My research is driven by people asking me questions usually, saying, well, what happens this and what happens there? And one of the questions is, do foxes kill cats? And should I look after my cat in my garden? Is the fox going to kill it? So I wanted to look at the interaction between animals in gardens. So we were looking at badgers, foxes, cats and hedgehogs, and seeing which ones were competing. So the other question is, do foxes kill hedgehogs? Do badgers kill hedgehogs? What's the interaction? How do we feed? So this was my question. Bowl of food, lots of people putting food out, bringing lots of animals into the same garden at the same time, what's going to happen? So, you know, it's like that big question, you know, you put two animals together, who's going to win? So just to show you a bit of the data of feeding, most people who feed wildlife feed every day, and they provide over 2 handfuls of food. So 73% of people who are feeding, and most of people put it in the same place. So they're creating a little area where there's reliable, consistent, high levels of food for animals to predictably come in and feed. And that is going to lead to competition between species in urban areas. And you can see here, in terms of some of the diet, so we've got that quite high levels of bread and carbohydrates in there as well. So what happens when you put foxes and cats together? So this is 2 foxes, you can spot the other one on the right, and this is 1 cat. So first of all, can you see the size of the fox compared to the cat? I think there is a misconception that foxes are very big. They're only just slightly bigger than cats, some of the weights. So 1 cat, 2 foxes. Yeah, so see, that cat sees it off quite easily. So this isn't just a one-off. First of all, you can see the amount of food that's been put out. It's a lot of food. And in some of the cameras that we were studying in gardens, we had 20 cats in one garden in one night. So we saw about 20 times as many cats as foxes where people were feeding. Another video, 2 cats. So the last one was 1 cat, 2 foxes. There's actually 2 foxes in this versus 2 cats. Yeah, cat sees it off straight away. So we had lots of videos of cats seeing off foxes. How do foxes interact with hedgehogs? So this is a female fox. You can see that she's just started lactating, so coming in for food. And there's a hedgehog there that's not doing a little squidge in terms of sticking his head up. There's a tiny little bit of fear there. But yeah, they're both eating in terms of food. So this is, you know, the fox and the hedgehog eating at the same place. And that could potentially tip into predation. So you've got to be careful when you're encouraging animals to the same place. The next, yeah, so in that case, that was a different fox. That was a male fox that came. But if you watch the video, what happens is, well, you can see in a few seconds. So the fox has taken the hedgehog and he's actually moved it out the way. So he picked it up, moved it, and then came back for the food. So there's competition here. So foxes and hedgehogs are actually competing for food, which could cause injury to the hedgehog, even if it's not predation. So this is some of our data from this study. So who wins between cats and foxes? When cats and foxes to get together, there was 80% of agonistic interactions. So they do annoy each other, but most of the time the cat wins. And there was no evidence of predation of foxes on cats. There was no evidence of predation of hedgehogs on cats that we, hedgehogs on cats? Foxes on hedgehogs. And then in terms of foxes and badgers, badgers win over foxes, cats win over foxes. So, you know, foxes don't do well in relation to cats. So that's my answer to that question. It's usually the cat that chases off the fox. So just in summary, we have discovered that urban fox distribution has changed in the last 30 years and they're found in more cities. The densities in urban habitats have increased in some cities that they've recently colonised. Other cities, they seem to be stable. There's a smaller home range and large dispersal distances can happen. They focus on feeding areas in the night and they have smaller territories where there's larger gardens. Mange is widespread with a northwest hotspot at the moment. If you're treating foxes, it's best to treat them in situ rather than take them into rehab. There's lots of anthropogenic feeding going on and we don't know what the consequences are at the moment. It could affect animal health, but it's definitely affecting animal interactions. So there's competition between animals in gardens. So that's something that we need to be careful of if we're going to be responsible feeders. So just thanks to everybody involved in the research. Obviously it's about 9-10 years, a bit more now, lots of different input and lots of people. And that's me for any questions. I'm slightly over, I'm sorry.
Thank you ever so much, Dawn. No, it was perfect in terms of timing and a really informative. You covered a lot of ground and there was, a lot of food for thought. I think you have picked up already on some of the things that are coming through the chat and some of the main things that people want to know and understand about foxes. And I think kind of exploding some of the myths that do seem to get a lot of coverage in some, particularly in some of the media. So it's really good that we understand that properly and really know what the kind of the facts are. I was particularly impressed with the fleet traveling 195 miles. That is an incredible journey. Is there any, we'll go to the other people's questions, but is there any sort of a sense about why that particular fox travelled such a long way before it found somewhere that seemed kind of an appropriate place to settle?
Yeah, well, we were looking at that actual fox family, and we think that was a dominant fox that was getting older, and then he had an interaction with his son, and he developed a cough, and so there was another younger male fox that seemed to become more dominant, and it sounded like he had lungworm as well. And then we think he was displaced just before he ran off. He did a temporary displacement within Brighton and then came back. And then a month later, he dispersed. So it was likely that the pressure of the population was causing him to move anyway. And then I think when he got out of Brighton, there's a main road, and he sat by the road under a bush for about 3 days. And I think he just couldn't get back. And then he ran off and looked for somewhere else. So that's my anthropogenic interpretation of his behaviour.
Yeah, well, I mean, in a sense, that's all we have, isn't it, to kind of see it from a human point of view. Okay, thank you ever so much for that. We're going to go to the chat now. There's lots of already people saying, thank you very much. That's been really interesting talk, but we've got loads of questions. So, David, are you all right to pick out a couple from the chat? And then if anyone would like to ask a question in person, do kind of please do your virtual hand, because there's such a lot of you, it's hard to pick you out. And then we can pick up a couple of in-person questions as well. So over to you, David, to start off with.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, there were quite a few discussions. So I think there were some discussions. I'll paraphrase a few questions at once. Are we seeing changes in foxes in the urban environment because of the different habitats, or evolutionary changes, both to their structure, to their behaviour? Are we selecting them for tameness by feeding? So a general interest in that, what the impact on foxes is.
Yeah, so there was a recent paper that was actually looking at morphological features in relation to the skull shape, and they found that the skull shape seemed to be changing slightly to an animal that is typically more domesticated. So there's been lots of studies done on fox personality traits and selective breeding for certain traits. So there was some suggestion that this characteristic could be coming out in terms of an evolutionary pressure of living in urban environments. It's very difficult in terms of the question on personality and bold. I've made some suggestions that animals in urban environments might have to be more intelligent because they have to solve problems. But defining personality and problem solving can be quite tricky in a wild animal population. What we found is that actually foxes have varied personalities, very varied. So you might get very shy ones and very bold ones. What is bold? It's a response to a stimulus. Once it's had that, it might change again. So you do get variation in the population. There's a suggestion there could be selection both ways towards an animal that is likely to be less neophobic, so scared of new things in an urban environment. Because if you're terrified of everything, you're not going to do very well in an urban environment. But I think there's a place for species with different personalities. So animals with different personalities are likely to, by being shy and keeping away from people, that might be a beneficial strategy. But yeah, so a fox litter itself will have lots of different animals with different personality traits, on bold to very shy, and whether they do well, the dominant ones tend to be what we say is more neophobic, so maybe a little bit more scared, and the ones that are subordinate tend to be more exploratory in terms of investigating, and that was a recent paper that was out as well.
So it's interesting that there can be advantages in different kinds of ways, different kinds of personalities, and that and again, I suppose because urban environments are so complex, maybe that's why there's opportunities to be operated in slightly different ways, and they can be successful. So if and I presume, urban environments are not uniform anyway, are they? So there must, it's interesting that there is a kind of mixture of effective kind of behaviour. So David, I'm going to go ask you for the next question from the chat, but just to
Yeah.
remind you, if people would like to ask in person, we have got time to take a couple of in-person questions, so do let us know if you're interested in doing that. Okay, over to you, David.
Yeah, I'll paraphrase another few as well, if I may. There's a bundle of questions about feeding foxes, varying from what would be a good thing to feed them, what would be appropriate. Is it a good thing to feed them at all? Should we be encouraging it? Should we be discouraging it?
So I think there are lots of benefits of interacting with wildlife. I think people that feed animals want to help them and support them. And I think we've just got to be careful how we feed. So if people can choose more natural food items for them rather than leftovers, if I feed a hedgehog or a fox, I tend to give it an egg. And the reason for that is because it's completely natural and the fox can carry it away and cache it as well. So they can actually hold it in their mouths and carry it away. And it's a good parcel food source. So when that animal's gone, there's no food there to increase competition. So something like that might be beneficial. I think the thing that I picked up is the predictability and the amount. And that means that the animals are not foraging for anything else and they're only having the diet that people are providing, and that might not be very healthy. So my recommendation is don't feed every day. Make sure it's as natural. Make it unpredictable, and also if you are feeding, then obviously enjoy that experience, but do it at a distance and never feed by hand. Just don't. I know it's nice and it feels amazing to get close to an animal, but your experience and that positivity is not going to be the same as if that fox walks up to somebody else. So just make sure you keep your distance and don't make it too reliant on that food source, so that it does forage for other food as well. I hope you answered everything.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's something that really people need to understand in more depth, what the consequences are, because they can be, people can be very well-meaning, but the consequences not necessarily work out that well for the fox, fox concern. We're going to go now to an in-person question. So James Doig, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have it was a fox red colour, actually. And a few weeks back, we were out late at night and a young fox started to follow us. And my dog chased after us, but we got to safety. We're on the outskirts of Dundee. And so I called the dog back, put him on the lead, and the young fox came out again. And it was following us. Strangest ever experience. I'll remember it forever. More, and we'd kind of like to understand what was going on. If you can shed any light on it, please.
Yeah, and I mean, we have lots of these different stories of people interacting with foxes and foxes doing slightly atypical behaviour. So first of all, you don't know what that experience of that fox is. So it might have actually been raised in a sort of suburban type garden and then moved. And so it might be used to people. It might associate you or somebody about with food coming out. Or it might be just quite interested in the fact that there's something there or a dog there. I don't know the size of your dog, but usually smaller dogs, we've had lots of foxes play with dogs. Not necessarily aggressively, but come out and want to play and investigate.
Yes.
There's toxoplasmosis. There's some in terms of lungworm and other diseases that foxes can get that can cause them to behave unusually. So in some cases, we've had people which the foxes have come very close or sometimes potentially been aggressive. And it's usually found that that fox is suffering from some form of parasite or disease that's causing it to be less scared. So that fox could have all sorts of different things going on in terms of either experience or whether it's hungry, it might be breeding or trying to protect something, or so there's lots of different reasons why. But yeah, there's some fascinating examples and stories of interactions with foxes.
Yeah, it certainly seemed to be in a playful mood and looked quite healthy. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, James. We're going to go to John Tucker next. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? Hi, are you there, John? You're managing, you look like you're unmuted. Do you want to ask a question? Okay, we'll go to another question in the chat, David, and we'll come back to you, John, see whether we can hear you in a second. David, do you want to pick something else out from the chat?
Yeah, so there's some questions about rural and urban populations, whether you can say about the relative size, and a particular question about whether things like fox hunting and for other animals, badger baiting out in the countryside are helping to drive them into the urban areas.
So it's not causing necessarily to drive into urban areas. What you've probably had in terms of processes is a growth in suburban areas which have overtaken some of the original territories. They've been able to stay and adapt. Those foxes have increased in numbers as the city's grown, the foxes have spread. And then as we've seen from the colonisation process, is that it's likely that those animals in suburban areas have overspilled. But urban and rural foxes, you know, on the edges of cities and towns and villages, you can get animals that are using the rural and the urban area. So what is an urban fox? What is a rural fox? It just depends where you find them and what they have been exposed to in terms of potentially their behaviour. So there's no genetic differences. They do intermingle, they do interbreed. You get foxes in urban areas going to rural and both ways. So it's not necessarily pushing them into cities. There's more foxes in cities spilling out, as it were. In terms of numbers, fox populations are going down in rural areas. The most recent sort of population trend monitoring showed around about a 25% decline. It might be associated with other disease processes such as rabbit hemorrhagic virus, which has caused rabbits to decline. And so we're seeing a potential predator decline as well. But in terms of mortality, the number of foxes killed on road are really, really high, and badgers as well, which is going to have an impact on those populations.
I wonder if we can just talk about rats and foxes, because that's come up a couple of times in the chat. People sort of saying, are they effective as sort of controllers of local rat populations? Because there's certainly that's a kind of a comment that you hear. I wonder if there's any truth in that.
So we do know foxes do take multiple different species in an urban environment. I've had videos and been informed of foxes taking rats. In terms of population control, they would have to take a lot of rats to be able to have a knock on terms of the numbers, because rat populations can increase quicker than foxes can eat them. Plus, taking a rat is probably a lot harder than going into somebody's back garden and getting fed chicken. So, you know, we can see from the movement behaviour, they're not doing masses of foraging. They tend to just go in a few gardens where they get fed. But we do know they can take rats, so they can be part of that regulation process.
Yeah, there's a couple of people, somebody in the chat sort of says they think their local foxes are pretty good at keeping their rat population down. So I suppose if it's another kind of positive, a positive thing to point out. We could take one last quick question, David, if there's one last thing to finish off on.
Yeah, so there was a question someone asked, which I think is a good one to end on, which said that, you know, they're very interested in looking after and caring for urban foxes. Is there a good organisation you'd suggest they get involved with? Other than the London Natural History Society, of course.
What do you mean in terms of actually being involved in supporting foxes or working with foxes?
Yeah, let me find the actual question that the person asks. So there's so many of these, it's quite tricky to find them all. So he'd like to be a volunteer for urban foxes. Can you recommend some NGO for volunteering? Was the specific question.
Okay, so in terms of volunteering for any wildlife, there's lots of different organisations you can get involved with. I think it's a matter of, it depends what you're interested in, because obviously there's lots of rehabilitation centres, but they tend to target certain species, and obviously we've got to be very careful of what we do there as well. We've got to make sure we do the best practice. But there's organisations called the Fox Project. They provide lots of information on foxes and help people. There's some humane societies, so you know there's a couple of organisations that if people do have problems with foxes, they can talk through some of the humane solutions with them, and that's helpful. Just having somebody to talk to about what problems and to give you some solutions rather than killing an animal is really helpful, because what we find is if you kill an animal, it just creates a territory vacuum and an animal moves in. You never solve the fact that you're going to have foxes. We are always going to have foxes in cities, I think, now. So what we have to do is try and manage how if you don't want them in, you can do other things, but I think, you know, there's lots of ways you can humanely try to reduce some of the problems you have, and that's, people always need that advice. That helps.
Thanks, that's great. So we're gonna need to finish off there, although we have still got a few more questions. I know Dawn's gonna make sure that people, I think did you put your email contact in before, or are you okay to just kind of share some kind of contact details now? So if people would like to get in touch, if there's any questions that you didn't get answered, then you're most welcome to do that. So thank you very much, Dawn, for volunteering, offering to do that for us. That was a fantastic talk. We get a lot of nice comments in the chat coming through about things, people saying thank you, great talk, really enjoyed it, you know, learned so much. So thank you ever so much for coming.